How can just one person, with just a few words, completely change how the world sees something as huge as war? Well, today we're diving into the story of a soldier poet whose work from the trenches of World War I did exactly that. He absolutely demolished a romantic and frankly dangerous lie. And it all started with a simple Latin phrase that pretty much everyone believed.
See, at the start of the 20th century, this phrase was everywhere. It summed up everything a young man was supposed to believe about going to war. It was drilled into them, a noble, heroic call to arms. But what does it actually mean?
It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. That was the official story. That was the glorified, romantic ideal of combat. War was this grand adventure, a test of your character, a noble sacrifice. But one man who actually lived through it would famously call this the old lie.
Okay, so to really get how revolutionary Wilfred Owen's poetry was, we first have to understand the world he was writing against. This was an age of intense patriotism, where the true horrors of modern industrial warfare were completely unimaginable to the people back home.
This right here perfectly captures the two sides of the coin. On one side, you've got poets like Rupert Brooke writing these beautiful, patriotic sonnets about honor and glory. On the other side, you have Wilfred Owen. He wasn't some idealist writing from a safe distance. He was a witness, right there on the front lines, and he used this stark, brutal realism to show the trauma he was seeing every single day.
So what gave Owen's work so much power, so much authority? The answer is incredibly simple. He was there. His poetry wasn't some abstract thought experiment about patriotism. It was born directly from his firsthand experience of the mud, the gas, and the bloodshed. This timeline really shows you his brief but unbelievably impactful life. He enlists in 1915, and just 2 years later, he's in the thick of it, experiencing the full horror of the trenches. A huge moment comes when he meets another poet, Siegfried Sassoon, who instantly saw the raw power in his writing and really pushed him to channel that trauma into his work. But the ultimate tragedy, the detail that just perfectly defines the pity of war he wrote about, is that he was killed in action just 1 week before the armistice was signed. The world wouldn't even read his most powerful poems until years after he was gone.
So how exactly did Owen use his poetry to just tear down this myth of a glorious war? Let's get into the specifics of how his poems became a direct testimony against the old lie. And we have to start with his most famous work.
I mean, what a bold move. He takes that famous propaganda phrase and uses it as the title for his most powerful poem. Right from the get-go, he's telling you what he's about to do. He's going to attack this romantic idea head-on by showing you the grim, ugly reality behind those pretty words.
And he does not hold back. He uses this visceral, unforgettable language to describe the horror of a chlorine gas attack. He forces the reader to watch a man floundering like a man in fire or lime, a man literally drowning in his own lungs. There was nothing heroic about it. It was grotesque, and he wanted everyone to see it, to feel it.
So the amazing thing about this poem is that it works on so many levels. Yeah, it's a graphic description of a gas attack, but it's also a deep dive into the psychological trauma of the guys who survived and had to watch it happen. By showing the ugly, gurgling truth of how a soldier could die, the poem becomes this undeniable argument against the whole idea of a glorious war. Okay, let's look at another one of his masterpieces, Anthem for Doomed Youth. In this one, he shifts his focus a bit. It's less about the physical horror of death and more about the tragic loss of dignity for an entire generation of young men who were treated like, well, cattle.
What passing bells for these who die as cattle? That's the first line. That's the question he asks, and he answers it. He tells us their only funeral bells are the monstrous anger of the guns. Their only choir is the wailing shells. He's mourning not just their deaths, but the sheer senselessness of it all, the stolen potential of millions of young men who didn't even get a proper goodbye.
So we know what Owen was saying was powerful, but how he said it, that was just as revolutionary. He actually forged a whole new poetic voice, creating techniques that made his poetry sound just as jarring and broken as the world he was describing.
And you know, he wasn't doing this completely alone. His friendship with Siegfried Sassoon was absolutely vital. Sassoon was another soldier poet who hated the war, and he helped Owen sharpen his raw talent into a weapon. And, so importantly, he made sure Owen's work got collected and published after he died.
And this brings us to one of his most brilliant innovations, a technique called para-rhyme. So instead of a nice perfect rhyme like love and dove, you get these half rhymes that are just off. They don't quite connect, like groined and groaned. They sound wrong, and that's the point. It creates this jarring, unsettling feeling for the reader that perfectly mirrors the chaos and unease of war itself. It's absolute genius.
So, after all this, what's the ultimate takeaway from Owen's short, tragic life and his incredible work? Well, it all comes down to his central, unforgettable message about what conflict truly is.
1. Just 1 week. That's how close Wilfred Owen was to surviving the war when he was killed. A single week stood between him and going home. If anything hammers home the senseless tragedy he wrote about, it's that single, heartbreaking number.
And his legacy today is just immense. He's considered one of the greatest war poets in history, a central voice for understanding World War I. He didn't just write about war, he completely changed how we write about war. He gave a voice to the suffering of the common soldier and offered this unsparing yet deeply compassionate look at the true human cost of it all.
In the end, his own words really say it best. He wasn't interested in writing about glory or heroes or nations. He said, "My subject is war, and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity." For him, that's where the real truth was.
Owen used his art to be a witness, to speak a really difficult truth to a world that didn't want to hear it. And that kind of leaves us with a big question for our own time. Who are our witnesses now, and what truths are our artists trying to tell us today?